Hello and welcome back. This is Transmedia Storytelling from Mythology to Marvel, Lecture 12, Collaborative Authorship, Clear Canons, and Multiplicity. So when we start talking about authorship, I mean, we all know what an author is, the person that wrote the book, right? Well, the author, or the concept of author, is a key lens through which audiences can understand whether or not something is authorized, right? So to say that something is authorized, that something is canonical, is basically to say whether or not something actually happens inside of a story world. In the history of licensed stuff, a lot of those kinds of tie-in comics or tie-in books and so on and so forth are not, I mean, they may be like, authorized by the brand, but they're not included in the same narrative design as the storyteller originally had in mind. And frequently, those sorts of things are not very well bound together. This gets back to the kind of mental WTF moments that I described in the introduction to this class, where the Transformers story in the comics was not the same as the Transformers story in the TV shows, which is not the same as the Transformers comics or Transformers stories in the movies and so on and so on, right? So when you start deliberately tying those pieces together into some transmedia experience that is very clearly meant to be experienced together, then whether they share a single author is frequently a key notion as to whether or not something in those ancillary media, those other media than the original one, quote unquote, really happen, right? Now, that said, it's also impossible for one single author to write everything in a vast transmedia franchise, which is frequently why you see multiple authors working together or collaborating to create some vast franchise. Right? And nowadays, it is becoming frequently common for those franchises to create empty spaces, kind of like the negative spaces we were talking about in our last lecture, for fans to write their own stories, to basically serve as jumping off points or invitations for those fans to come and play. So that idea that you can create a world that is designed for your audience to write part of it, with you or for themselves, is a great way to ensure that your story world will be spreadable, that those fans will want to share that work that they create with each other. However, that idea that there's so many invitations for other people to come and play also leads itself to this notion of multiplicity, which is a direct 180-degree opposition to the idea of a singular canon, a singular authorized story in which everything matters, everything takes place. And that multiplicity is exactly the opposite of that, which is to say that multiple versions of this thing can exist at the same time, and not necessarily in competition with each other, but in ways that the existence of multiple versions leads to an overall greater experience for everybody. So we'll get back to that here in the second half of this talk. So when getting back to that idea of licensed work, right? So when Buffy the Vampire Slayer was first on the air, it had a traditionally licensed comic book, and the sales of this thing were okay, but it wasn't considered a canonical extension of the world. Characters could die in the comic and still be running around alive in the TV show because there was not a great deal of coordination between the people that wrote the comic and the people that were writing the show. Now, that's exactly what Dark Horse undid when they came back and did Buffy the Vampire Slayer season 8. Basically, when they did the official continuation of Buffy the Vampire Slayer into comics, and to do that, they said, okay, everything in this matters. Everything in this is exactly what would have happened after the end of the TV show. And to show you that we're serious, we're going to bring back Joss Whedon, right? And so Joss Whedon, the guy that created Buffy the Vampire Slayer, the showrunner for the show, you can see it here. He wrote and architected the story starting on with season 8, Buffy the Vampire Slayer season 8, number 1. And you can see the middling sales, down there, the individual episodes, individual issues of the original licensed comic, going up through Buffy the Vampire Slayer issue 63. And then when they turned around and said, okay, we're going to do this, but with the original showrunner writing it, him telling us what his vision was for this thing moving forward, what would have happened if the show hadn't been canceled, the jump in sales was astronomical, right? So that idea of this really happened absolutely matters to audiences. Now, sometimes this works for different characters and sometimes it doesn't. When you deal with some characters, there is, like we talked about Batman before, right? So in The Many Lives of the Batman by William Urquio and Roberta Persson, what they're talking about is this idea that Sherlock Holmes was very clearly authored by a single author, Arthur Conan Doyle, right? Other characters like James Bond, when Bond first got going, was written by Ian Fleming, and you can point to that body of work by Ian Fleming and says this is the Super Bond, this is the original, the OG Bond, James Bond, right? Now, those characters then tend to take on a life of their own as they go from becoming authored by a single person into multiple people over time. So you could make that argument to say, well, did Sherlock Holmes ever meet Cthulhu? Well, not in the original Doyle stories, so did he ever really meet Cthulhu? No. But have other people written stories about Sherlock Holmes meeting Cthulhu and the crossover between Sherlock Holmes and H.P. Lovecraft's Call of Cthulhu mythos stuff? Absolutely. So then that question becomes like, okay, what is canon and what isn't? What is part of the original character story, and then what is part of these other extensions, these expansions, this multiplicity? So if you have a very clear break between what happened with that original author, like Sir Arthur Conan Doyle with Sherlock Holmes, say, yeah, what happened with Doyle's original version of the character, that quote-unquote really happened to the character. Everything else that has come beyond that is basically, fan fiction, right? Or different interpretations of that character, but it's not part of the same story. Other characters, that's not so clear, right? So when you have other characters like Batman, where the original version, like by Bob Kane and Bill Finger, that was, their vision of Batman, but Batman was not owned by, Kane and Finger. It was owned by DC Comics. And so over the years, that character of Batman has accreted different kinds of characteristics as it has gone from author to author to author to author. This is what Mark J.P. Wolfe refers to as transauthorial. Right? So we can talk about a particular franchise or a brand being transmedial as it jumps from medium to medium, but you can also look at particular stories where the canonical narrative is passed from writer to writer to writer to writer as part of the original plan, and that kind of narrative is transauthorial. And that kind of approach is very, very, very frequently taken in television. Right? So TV is almost never written by a single author. Usually what happens is you wind up with some showrunner here with Lindelof and Cruz here. So these two characters were the showrunners for Lost, right? And while they architected the overall experience of Lost, while they would oversee the writer's room and to break the big plot for that particular story, each individual episode would be written by a different author, right? And then they would be brought back together again into the writer's room, and all the writers together would sort of smooth off the edges and ensure that what was finally delivered to the audience was a pretty smooth experience. That's the theory. That's the ideal, right? When you imagine a TV writer's room, this kind of image here is what tends to spring to mind, where you have the giant timelines up in the corner, you have the headshots of the characters, posted off on the wall, you have the whiteboards, full of notes, and everything seems here to be all brought together in a very tight and elegant sort of cohesion. In reality, most writers' rooms look more like this, right? Where you wind up having a bunch of people sitting around kind of spitballing ideas. There is some kind of general cohesion, sort of, but it's much less elegant, right? This is exacerbated by the even before COVID, writers tended to be widely distributed, right? So you might have like a core group of story editors, right? So Lucasfilm, for example, employed this group called the Lucasfilm Story Group that was housed primarily there in San Francisco at the Lucasfilm offices. But they would employ this vast stable of writers, to write tie-in novels and comics and whatever. And those would be those authors would be all over the globe. So my friend Chuck Wendig here, this was a picture of the original writer's shack that he wrote in his little cabin in Pennsylvania. And out of that tiny little shack came these big stories. So Chuck most famously wrote the Aftermath trilogy, which was a set of prequels leading up to the release of Star Wars The Force Awakens. And he did that using a set of guidelines and a set of parameters that were passed down to him that were basically the writer's guides for how to write a story in the Star Wars universe. And that guidebook, right, which tends to feel a little bit like a guidebook for telling stories in a role-playing game like Dungeons and Dragons, is very much what you guys are writing in this class. So these narrative design documents that I'm having you create are basically a shared rule set according to which multiple people will be able to write stories in your worlds. Now, that kind of an approach, right, is inspired partly by game design documents, but also by these things. So these are writer's Bibles, and if you go on a Moodle, you will find a collection of sample writer's Bibles that I've collected off the web that are taken from a bunch of the biggest TV shows on TV. So what you'll see is that they tend to consist of an overall high-level view of what makes that world special, what the world's rules are, who the main characters are, and then in many cases start to move into an episode-by-episode breakdown as to how that kind of story will unfold over the first season, over multiple seasons. It varies from project to project. And so that's something else I want you to keep in mind. The template that I'm having you populate here is one that I've developed over the years that I've worked with a bunch of these different companies. But it's not the definitive standard. Different shows, different games, different properties are going to use different formats depending on who their showrunners are. Right? So the basic underlying exercises and the basic underlying concepts that I'm having you work through in this class are going to serve you well no matter what kind of a creative project and what kind of a creative group you're going to be working in. So another way of looking at this, like I said before, is to think not just about who you're going to pass those Bibles on to other professional writers or professional artists that will be working with you on the project, but also the kind of rules that you're setting up for your audiences to follow as they start to imagine who they would be inside of that world. Right? So we've talked about this a little bit before, the idea of designing these story worlds so that they're inviting people to play. It's not an accident that I'm talking about designing these things as a guidebook for Dungeons and Dragons style role-playing campaigns, right? Dungeons and Dragons has itself a history. There are notable characters, there are notable monsters, there's a sketch of the timeline inside of that kind of a world, but really it's more about who your players are or who your players imagine themselves to be, the characters that they invent to exist inside of that world, than it is necessarily about the legendary characters that the story writers themselves have put together. Now, obviously, that's not necessarily the case when you're talking about something like Star Wars. Obviously, for something like Star Wars, you are building these big legendary characters. Harry Potter, right? What's Harry Potter without Harry Potter? But at the same time, by creating this kind of a platform and an invitation to play, to opening up that world in such a way that it presents people lenses through which they can use their own imaginations, to light up their negative capability, like we talked about in the last lecture, that is a fantastic way to guarantee that these fans are going to want to share that work with other fans as well, right? So that's exactly what the houses in Harry Potter are for. It's exactly what that invitation to play by asking who the Sorting Hat would put, what house the Sorting Hat would put you into. That's exactly what that sort of thing is for. Similarly, these big maps that have the Here Be Dragons, open spaces, these negative spaces on them. That's exactly what that's for, right? Now, the other thing about that, though, is that as much as it's useful to think about this as sketching out a set of rules, your fans are people, and especially when you get very passionate, very creative people, sometimes when they're presented with such rules, their overwhelming response is going to be, well, screw you too, buddy. So that's something we're going to have to come back to, because what happens when fans break those rules is amazing, right? So these kinds of cosplay outfits that mash up multiple IPs, these are the sort of thing that give lawyers hernias, right? when you see an IP lawyer, descending upon something like the Star Wars or the Star Trek fandom, Paramount famously unleashed their lawyers on the Star Trek fandom not once but multiple times over the years, and it has always had a chilling effect on the relationship between the studio and their fans, right? And they are within their rights to do so, but hold on for a second, because sometimes that kind of aghast lawyer, IP owner person, clutching their pearls, is not necessarily the best solution to the problem. So keep calm and hold that thought for a second. Another way of thinking about this, when you're thinking about that idea of a canon, of a single story that is told across multiple platforms, across multiple authors in an orchestrated way, right? This is where you start, building out these kind of high-level stories with characters like Superman. Being able to slot those beside each other with different kinds of target audiences for each one is a way of multiplying your total possible box office take, or your total possible audience engagement, depending on how well developed you have built your original property, right? So that said, when you have too many of these things in the market, it's not always clear which version is which, right? So the fact that there is a version of Superman that's told in the comics, and another one that's told in TV, and another one's told in feature film, and another one's told in a different TV show, and another one's told in a different set of comics, this can get incredibly confusing for audiences, right? So we don't want to have that sort of, oh God, which universe does this particular story take place in? Does this story hitch back to this other story that I knew, or is this something completely on its own? What is this, right? You do not want to confuse your audiences. So Johann Huizinga, who is a games scholar and a games theorist, came up with this idea called the magic circle, right? And what he's describing is basically, if you run around and you run up to some stranger in a parking lot and you smack him in the back of the head, that's going to be grounds for a lawsuit. But if you're running around on a playground and you have agreed, with your friends that you're allowed to run up and smack each other and then shout, "Tag, you're it," and then you're expected to chase them, right? Then within the bounds of that particular group of friends that have agreed to the set of rules, that's what's called a magic circle, right? It is a contained space or group of people or time within which a particular set of agreed upon rules shall pertain, that those rules will hold, right? It is a divergence from reality, a divergence from normalcy within this particular contained bounds, for the purpose of fun, right? And so if you take that notion that within these spaces, these special rules shall obtain, and you apply that to these kinds of franchises, well, then you can start to understand that each one of these individual worlds, these individual canons, have their own individual sort of magic circles drawn around them, so that the rules that bound each one of these stories are similar, but they differ in interesting ways, whether that a reinterpretation of the original story is with a different set of characters, or it's set in a different time period, or it's set in a different part of the world. All these are interesting ways of reinterpreting the original IP, or the original intellectual property, in a way that's going to appeal to somebody outside the audience of that original. Right? So this gets back to that idea of rules, of setting up a set of rules that will pertain to each individual version of that story. Now, Lucas himself, the creator of Star Wars, he knew when Star Wars first started to take off that other people were going to want to play in the Star Wars universe, that he was not going to be the only person that could tell stories in that world. And because Lucas is an incredibly shrewd businessman, he knew that there was tons of gold in them there hills for him to harvest, right? So in this introduction to Splinter of the Mind's Eye, which is the first tie-in Star Wars novel by Alan Dean Foster, Lucas wrote this. He said there were many stories to be told about the characters who inhabit this galaxy, but these were not stories that I was destined to tell. Instead, they would spring from the imagination of other writers inspired by the glimpse of a galaxy that Star Wars provided. Today is an amazing, if unexpected, legacy of Star Wars that so many gifted writers are contributing new stories to the saga. However, this presented a problem. So when Lucas himself came back to do the prequels, he didn't know what was happening across all these other stories. right? There were so many stories that have been told in the Star Wars universe that Lucas himself didn't know what was happening in the world that he'd created. And so what he did was he went out and he hired this guy named Steve Sansweet to come in and sort of think through a way to understand the Star Wars universe. And what Sansweet came up with was this model that looks an awful lot like the Target logo, right? And that idea was that there would be different tiers of canon, based on how close they were to the original Star Wars movies. So anything that Lucas himself wrote, imagine that as the bullseye in the center of the target, right? So those original movies, all that stuff really happened. But then moving out beyond that point, there were different expanding degrees of reality as to how these different stories actually did or did not happen within the Star Wars universe. It seems like an elegant solution, but okay. So this was a phrase. This quote was taken from the Wikipedia, and this is dealing with the Holocron, which is Lucasfilm's internal database, or sort of like an internal Wikipedia. Just tried to keep all this stuff straight. And this is Sansweet writing. He says, the holocron is divided into 5 levels in order of precedence: G canon, T canon, C canon, S canon, and N canon. G canon is absolute canon, the movies, the most recent release, the scripts, the novelizations of the movies, the radio plays, and any statements by George Lucas himself. G canon overrides the lower levels of canon when there is a contradiction. Within G canon, many fans follow an unofficial progression of canonicity, where the movies are the highest canon, followed by the scripts, the novelizations, and then the radio plays. T canon replaces the canon level comprising only the 2 television shows, Star Wars The Clone Wars, and the upcoming Star Wars live-action TV series. Spoilers, that didn't actually happen. This was something else instead of The Mandalorian. Its precedence over C-level canon was confirmed by Holocron manager Leland Chee, blah, 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 blah. Oh, my God. Right? To a casual fan, or even to a moderately passionate fan, this was migraine-inducing. Right? So how do you fix something like that? Well, it was fixed when Disney bought Lucasfilm. Right? So when Disney swooped in and bought Lucasfilm for like $4 billion, the first thing they did was they blew it up, right? They came in and they said, okay, outside of the movies, anything else that happened inside of the Star Wars universe didn't happen. These are all no longer going to constrain the stories that we're going to tell in the Star Wars universe. And those of us that had spent decades trying to keep all this crap straight, basically reacted like this, right? Because we had a vested interest in understanding all these extra secret histories and futures of the Star Wars universe. However, the rest of the universe kind of said, oh, thank God, right? And what happened was that Disney then went and clarified what was considered canonical and what wasn't. So, although they said that anything that was going to come out from that point forward was considered canonical, right? They also made this very clear distinction, so that anything that was officially, Disney-related Star Wars content had these sort of labels on the front that say, this is where this fits into the overall experience. But those things that were published before that break, before Disney bought it, they kind of turned them into a sort of apocrypha, right? So these were stories of things that might or might not have happened inside of the Star Wars universe. And so they put this Legends label, down along the bottom of all those, and then very happily continue to sell them because, Disney's not stupid. Now, I also see these kind of labels, clearly placed at the top of those books, like the ones that I talked about that Chuck wrote, the Aftermath novels, had this banner at the top that says The Journey to Star Wars: The Force Awakens, to tell fans where this should fit inside of the timeline. Similarly, later books would say things like Journey to Star Wars: The Last Jedi, or then later on, Journey to Star Wars: Rise of the Resistance, for the theme parks, or The Rise of Skywalker, right? Anyway, and all this was great, right? This kind of clarifying branding that exists over these things to tell people where these experiences were designed to fit into an overall narrative design was glorious. Like, it really made things easier to understand. It reduced transmedia resistance by a staggering amount. So it became incredibly, not easy, but easier to discover, collect, consume, react, and so on. Right? Now, again, keep calm, hold that thought. We're going to tie all this stuff back together again in a minute. If you go back to this notion of multiplicity, right? This idea that there are multiple versions of a thing that can stand beside one another and can coexist but appeal to different demographics. Another way of looking at this, right, is to go beyond that original four-quadrant model and then to start plotting out ways in which you can broaden that audience in through almost like a Z vector, going up and down. So in addition to the original Marvel Spider-Man comics, right, this incredibly long-lasting story, there have been other versions of Spider-Man that have been published over the years. So the Marvel Universe created this thing called the Ultimate Universe, back in the early 2000s, which was sort of a imagine if the Marvel Universe was being created today, sort of a story, and it worked so well that the Ultimate Universe is really the basis for most of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. And a large number of the characters that were created for that universe, or alternate versions of the characters that were made for that universe, have wound, even after the Ultimate Universe was shut down there a couple of years ago and sort of rolled back into the main universe, because it sort of did not sit well with the powers that be at Disney, that the Marvel Cinematic Universe was basically based on a shard or an alternate version of the quote-unquote real Marvel Universe. A bunch of those new characters, like Miles Morales, the African-American version of Spider-Man, have come back and joined the Marvel Universe and become super popular versions of those characters. Beyond that, there are also localized versions, right? So if you talk about localization, it's when you're translating something into a different language for a different market. And so Marvel did a version of Spider-Man India, right, which was a reimagining of the Spider-Man mythos set in India. But then there was also these other takes that were designed specifically for alternate audiences, kind of the same way that the Tales of Lois and Clark were that sort of romantic reimagining of the Superman story back in the 80s. Spider-Man Loves Mary Jane was a romantic manga-style comic, for younger female audiences back in the 90s and 2000s. So what Henry's talking about here is this notion of multiplicity enabling these things to stand as alternative versions of the characters or parallel universe versions of the stories as an alternative set of rewards for our mastery over the source material, right? So when I say that a different version of Superman, like when they did Smallville, or now that they're doing Superman and Lois new show on the CW that's coming out that's set in the sort of the Arrowverse, right? Hell, even the Arrowverse itself, the different versions of those characters, or the introduction, the remix, the reinterpretation of those kinds of characters were incredibly appealing to long-standing fans, not because of how they were similar to their predecessors in a way, but in many ways of how they were different. So somebody that had been reading Superman comics forever, right, might watch the new the Christopher Nolan movies to see how that character is updated for a new audience. Same thing goes for the Robert Pattinson Batman movie that's coming up. Fans that lived and died by the Christopher Nolan version, or even the Batfleck version from the Justice League movies, right? They'll still go see the Pattinson version to see what changes. They'll get a thrill out of the same bat tropes that have been so well established over the years. But in seeing how that familiar is made unfamiliar, how that is reinterpreted, is exactly what Henry's talking about here. So when he says that multiplicity allows fans to take pleasure in alternative retellings, seeing the characters and events from fresh perspectives, and comics publishers trust their fans to sort out not only how the pieces fit together, but also which version of the story any given work fits within, that's kind of what we're talking about here. To be able to use these multiple versions in order to breathe new life into a property that in many cases has been running for decades, right? Now, that said, it is still useful to use branding to clearly distinguish which stories fit into which versions of which universe, right? So in the same way that there's different versions of Superman, like Smallville or Lois and Clark are now the new Superman and Lois shows, the fact that those shows are called different things, not every show is just called Superman, is a way of clarifying, which version of that show you're watching the new episode of when you dial it up on Netflix later, right? So what DC Comics did was they created this imprint called Elseworlds, which was a sort of a series of what-if reimaginings that took a central deviation from reality of the original property and then added a second twist on top of that. So this was like saying, the first Elseworlds book, Gotham by Gaslight, imagined what would have happened if Batman had actually been running around in Victorian England and tried to track down Jack the Ripper, right? Interesting story. And that story itself got sequels. There was another one, Master of the Future, which came out a couple years later. And then that same version of sort of a Victorian steampunky sort of Batman has kept popping up in DC materials for years since. Just last year, maybe it was the year before, they did a full animated version, animated feature version of that original story. Another version of Batman was this Batman and Dracula trilogy of stories, which imagined what if Batman himself actually was a Batman and had been turned into a vampire, right? What happens when Batman descends into monstrosity? And then the other one that is like super, super, super famous inside of this space is Superman Red Sun, which imagines what if Kal-El had not crashed into Kansas, but it had instead his spacecraft had crashed into Soviet Russia, and what happens there? And just like with Gotham by Gaslight, DC Comics and Warner Brothers released another animated feature film of Superman Red Sun that came out last year, and that was actually really pretty well done. Anyway, so if you start thinking about it along these lines, that by making very clear delineations of what is and is not canon, that also helps studios start to think through what could or could not be permitted as far as audience participation is concerned, right? So this gets back to the notion of how Paramount sicked their lawyers onto the Star Trek fandom because they're super concerned about protecting the value of their intellectual property in the same way that a company like Xerox or Kleenex has to very aggressively defend the trademark over those terms. And it's a slippery slope, right? So when a product becomes so pervasive, so popular in the market, that it becomes synonymous with the verb itself, like to Google something, right? It doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to use Google to go look something up on the internet, but you're probably going to because Google has come to dominate that space so much. Or if you're going to blow your nose on a tissue, you might ask someone for a Kleenex. It may or may not be a Kleenex, but people know exactly what you mean when you ask for that. It's like Coke meaning any kind of soft drink in the South, right? Those property owners, the people that own Google, Kleenex, Xerox, Coke, I mean, they still have to go after people if they infringe on those copyrights because those copyrights, those brands are incredibly valuable, right? But at the same time, once you achieve that degree of ubiquity, that degree of success, other people are just going to want to, especially in story worlds, basically come and play. So if you start to look at these particular story worlds as invitations that they pose, just like the houses in Harry Potter that I mentioned before, or the colored outfits in Star Trek, then you go back to this, right? Then you start to understand this a little differently, because this isn't the kind of horrible encroachment upon somebody's IP, the sort of some fan giving the finger to the rules and the lawyers, so much as it is these people that are spending hundreds and hundreds of hours to craft these meticulously designed and in many cases incredibly detailed costumes to wear to things like to Comic-Con and things, as ways to communicate their own fandom to others and to demonstrate their own creativity through the lens of this thing that they love so much. This isn't a screw you to the IP owners. This is probably the most authentic testament to how much they love that property. Right? And so if you design a story world and you're creating empty spaces for your fans to participate, if you're creating sets of characters like the houses in Harry Potter that invite them to come and play, you got to be careful, because if you build it, they will come, right? And so if you wind up with these fans that are super passionate about the thing that you've done, you win, right? Do not sue them. Do not alienate them. If anything, if you have to try and control them, you give them spaces to share those stories with each other, which is part of your assignment, which is to say, I want you to go into those worlds and start to think through what kind of spaces you might set aside for those for fans to imagine who they would be. Right, so that's either going to be ways in which fans are going to be asked to imagine what house they would be in Harry Potter, what kind of demon animal they would have in his Golden Compass, the Dark Materials, or to imagine what kind of mutant powers that they would have in X-Men and things like that, but also to think through what kind of platforms you might provide for them to share that with each other. So how are you going to invite your fans to participate, and then how to take that creativity and share it with others, right? So in video games, for Halo has this thing called the Forge, which is an opportunity for fans to create their own levels of Halo and share them with each other. Same thing goes for Mario Maker on the Nintendo, right? The opportunity to take those materials that make up existing Mario games and remix them into new levels, right? I want you to think through that in a fiction perspective. So, for example, one of the things that I did for Spook Show was to create these empty spaces in that world and to create these character groupings of types of magicians, so that if people wanted to imagine, what their particular spook show, a traveling show of magicians, would feel like with them and their friends, then they could take that particular concept and share it online on a website that was dedicated specifically to that kind of thing. Right, and to create opportunities for them to run those characters, through that kind of story world and really embed themselves in it as a way of becoming more deeply engaged. So anyway, that's basically what we're asking you to do here for collaborative authorship, to think through how you're going to set up your stories and your Bibles in such a way that it invites your fellow storytellers to work with you, but also how to invite your audiences to become storytellers themselves. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you next time.